So thank you for that incredible introduction, a better introduction, I think, than I could have given myself. And thank you also for making time and space for us to be here today. I think it's really great that you had a conversation around Strike Germany previously. I mean, the German cultural context at the moment is a very impossible place to navigate. We support our friends and comrades that are striking. And I suppose I wanted to just start with the reasons that we're here today and the reasons that we're still engaging in forums in Germany. We feel, as a human rights organization doing anti-police, anti-racist, anti-fascist work, it's really important to protect this space and to protect the forums that we've tried to create by coming here to Berlin. It's obviously not easy at times to protect this space, increasingly difficult. In universities in particular, we're finding this. Recently, I was meant to give a lecture at Aachen, and this lecture was cancelled, partially because of our director and some baseless kind of accusations made against him. Eyal Weizmann is an Israeli man, and this just kind of shows the ridiculous situation that we're in now, but also in part due to our ongoing work in Palestine, protecting the rights of Palestinian people. I just wanted to say that we're grateful to be able to kind of continue having critical spaces with universities and to be able today to talk about two really, really important projects. And so that is why we're here today. So we've already had a kind of fantastic introduction about who Forensis is. As we said, it's a non-profit organization based in Berlin, and it's a really young office still, only a couple of years old and still a very small office. But as Lukas said, we're working for and in collaboration with individuals and communities affected by state and corporate violence to support their demands for justice, reparations, and accountability. As you can see by us two today, we're kind of an interdisciplinary team of researchers with different backgrounds but expertise in spatial and visual investigations. And as you were saying, we produce evidence not only for courtrooms and also political forums, but also cultural forums, and we kind of work at the interplay between these different forums to create new types of forums for talking about this kind of work. This is our office. We're hosted in ECCHR, which is the European Centre of Constitutional Human Rights, based in Kreuzberg. And together we've worked with ECCHR and Forensic Architecture to create what we call the Investigative Commons. This is a space, but it's also a community of practice. And it includes other investigative agencies, as well as activists, lawyers, and artists, including the Centre of Spatial Technologies, CST, the Fabrian Network, Earshot, Index, and many others. And we're the younger sister organisation, Forensis, of Forensic Architecture, and this is the office in London. It's a London agency based in Goldsmiths, University of London, and similarly it works to investigate human rights violations, including those committed by the states, police forces, militaries, and large corporations. It's a much older organisation than ours, and we share the same methodologies, the same conceptual underpinnings, and the same director, Eyal Weizmann. So today we're going to be talking about two cases of police brutality, but I think before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of these cases, it's worth going through some of the conceptual underpinnings of our work. And you'll see these kind of concepts really coming through the practice of the projects, and you'll see these threads kind of throughout the presentation today. But first, we're going to go through them one by one and explain them a bit further. So the first we'll start with is counterforensics. And so when we use the term forensics, we're using a word that is derived from the word forensis. And forensis can be translated to an open court or public, and this pertains to the forum. The Roman forum that forensis refers to was a space of not only law, but also politics and economics. And so when we look at the etymology of the word forensis or forum, we see that justice and politics were created or negotiated in a public space or a public sphere. But since this, the word has kind of undergone a linguistic shift. So the forum that was once considered a public space and negotiated has now increasingly come to refer to the court of law, and subsequently forensics to the use of medicine and science within the court of law, and one that is operated by the state. So this transformation, this linguistic transformation, illustrates the loss of the critical dimension of the practice of forensics, and specifically its potential as a political practice, as one of the art of the forum. So forensic architecture as a project returns to the origin of the term forensis, as this open court or public forum, as a way to try and expand the practice of contemporary forensics. And so within this expanded practice of forensics and this critical take upon it, we have come to call counter-forensics. And so when we talk about counter-forensics, we really mean turning the lens of investigation towards the state itself, and it revives this Roman understanding of the word forensics, which is a public and collective activity, not just one that's created by the state. So in other words, counter-forensics, what we're doing with it is trying to seek to critically question and suggest new possibilities for what we mean by the spaces and forums of law. And so I suppose the question is then, why architecture within counter-forensics? And I suppose it kind of comes to what you mean by architecture. So for us, architecture isn't just a static or motionless form, but it's a dynamic and temporal one. So we consider buildings as always in often imperceivable transformation and motion, reacting and registering forces. So by examining the built environment, you can reconstruct the processes and narratives of its transformation. You can read events, forces, and power structures through the matter and the marks that are inscribed on the walls. And in this sense, architecture acts as a spatial record of the forces that act around and upon it. So one small example is our ongoing work in Namibia, with and in the service of descendant communities of Herero and Nama peoples, attempting to get reparations in account of the German genocide. So within this, we're really carefully investigating the land, we're reading the land to understand the violence that has and continues to be inscribed upon it. To read the land in this way is what we call the aestheticization of evidence. So with the Namibian land already exists evidence to the violence. However, we have to aestheticize this evidence as a process of revealing this latent evidence within it. So this aestheticizing evidence really is about revealing hidden forces, hidden histories, or hidden events. So when we talk about the aestheticization of evidence, what we're talking about is the illustration and narration, adding a second truth being ascribed upon the evidence itself. And this is really central to what we're doing at Forensic Architecture and Forensis. We use spatial and media analysis to communicate through the source. Often we work with videos and images of violence captured by the public. But to understand these sources as evidence, we have to aestheticize them. We have to use our visual and spatial analysis to expand what is contained within the frame, to reveal or illustrate the evidence that's within it. A key technique for aestheticizing evidence is what we call operative models. So we see physical and 3D models not just as representations of future or fictional environments, as they're kind of normally understood within architecture and game design, but rather for us they function as optical, analytical, or operative devices. They help us synthesize data and understand the way in which an incident may have unfolded. These operative models function within our expanded mode of architecture, as described here by Eyal. He says, but in the forensic context, architecture can also be a mode of research, the means of locating disparate bits of evidence and data and composing the relations between them in space. And then finally, our investigations are part of what we're calling collective truth production, or what is known as collective truth production. And this recognizes that contemporary truth is never solid, but more fluid than ever before. Truth is never evident, and access to it is never immediate or certain. Contemporary truth is rather the result of a constructive process. Truth is formed, reformed, and deformed in the public sphere as a result of the constant opposition between divergent claims and recognized discourses. And this is really evident in the populist attack on public truth that we're witnessing globally today. At Forensis and Forensic Architecture, however, we engage within the crisis of truth that the new media has provoked. And in this sense, we see it as an opportunity to reconstruct progressive, democratic, and inclusive modes of truth production today. And so this is really what forensis and forensic architecture is about. It's about developing new tools and methods for collective forms of truth practices. And our work covers a range of topics from migration, decolonial reparation and restitution, state and corporate violence. Today, however, we're going to be looking at police brutality and focusing on 2 cases. And these cases really kind of show 2 different geographies, 2 different scales, and also 2 different approaches or kind of expertise in research that Jasper and I have. So now I will pass over to Jasper for the next part.
I have to go old school with this microphone. My microphone just broke. Thanks, Phoebe. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I think what I wanted to focus today's lecture on is kind of a specific set of methods that underpins parts of our research and most of the research that I'm invested in and part of, which is more around the background research, how really textual information ties to visual information, and how we operate at this intersection of kind of really bringing to the fore and kind of revealing certain information and data that at first might seem visible, but often is invisibilized in images and really requires a certain specific set of techniques to look at. So I want to begin with the image, which is the image is where most of our investigations begin, and also form the medium through which we present our findings. We present our findings as videos in galleries and museums, but also national international courtrooms and public truth forums. So it's really both kind of like the essential material which we work, but also the way in which we present and communicate our findings. And it's also spaces like these, universities, lecture theatres, critical spaces to watch and witness and discuss the events that trigger our investigations. So as an investigative agency, forensic architecture and forensics alike draw from the shift and the leap that happened in the way that we as humans and society perceive, record, reproduce and communicate ourselves. A shift towards the omnipresence of the audiovisual. So as investigators, we use videos to both tell stories, our stories, but also specifically the stories of the people that we work with and on behalf of, people that have experienced the state, corporate and environmental violence as well as colonial violence. Digital imagery capturing these scenes of violence, these gross acts of human rights abuses are the essential material, if you want to say so, that we that make us operate in the way we do. But sometimes the imagery, photos and videos, or other forms of visual data perhaps show violations, such as police suppressing civilians expressing their dissent, and taking protests to the streets, such as here in Portland, Oregon in 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, which will be the focus of my presentation. And they don't reveal all the information that we need. And it's never really fully revealed what is behind it. This is where we as an investigative agency become most needed. It is when we reinterpret, analyze, and kind of like really try to address the gaps and fill the gaps in the evidence that is needed to build a pathway towards accountability. Which speaks to an essential step in our investigative, that is informing the image in the way in which we reveal the information that is behind it, but also insert information that makes and renders images legible to legal systems, but also to broader audiences, and bring together contexts that otherwise have not been clear. The place and time I want to speak about today, as I mentioned before, is Portland, Oregon. is one of the latest investigations that I worked on. And what you were seeing here, oh no, it disappeared already, was a selection of collected evidence of videos of nearly 1,000 cases of police brutality in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter protests in the US. To set the scene, as many of you all remember, if not all, the Black Lives Matter protests swept across the US and also the world to protest and resist racialized police violence in the state and also in other countries. Also here in Germany and in Europe, many protesters took to the streets in solidarity with these events. And also kind of like recodified what it means, what is racialized police brutality. Here in Germany, it's enacted very differently than in the States, but unfortunately so, you can see a lot of parallels to how racialized police regimes operate, how they conceal and how they kind of like reinforce their logic. In Portland, these processes lasted for weeks, months, even well into the year afterwards, until 2021. And the PPB, the Portland Police Bureau, used tear gas in an unprecedented amount to protest these protests and create a seemingly kind of paradoxical situation in which the police was responding to protests against police violence with an ever more increasing amount of police brutality and violence. But also paradoxical only at first sight, because sadly enough, it really follows the corrupted logic of violent policing regimes around the world, also as this investigation has revealed. So I was still working in London at the time for forensic architecture before coming to Berlin a bit less than a year ago to start working for Forensis here in the Berlin office. And in 2021, forensic architecture was contacted by lawyers, activists, and artists from Portland to investigate the protest and understand how the violence unfolded. It was kind of a year, not really a year after these protesters really took over of the city, and kind of you had an insane amount of police officers on the street. But it was also 2020, just before Trump was re-elected, or was actually up for re-election, just as now again. And he really used Portland to kind of like try to set up an kind of this veneer of a law and order president. So he sent in federal law enforcement, border security agents, and the National Guard to really paint this image of a hard-ruling, iron-fisted president. We were contacted to understand kind of the resistances and also the acts and forces of suppression that the PPB, the Portland Police Bureau, had enacted, and wanted to work towards a pathway towards holding the ones that enacted such acts of violence accountable. And the focus was put specifically on the use of chemical weapons and tear gas. This was especially pressing as many people started reporting long-term effects and health effects, especially from the mass-scale deployment of chemical weapons in the form of CS gas, commonly referred to as tear gas, and other vapors. So we started investigating. Very quickly, we were presented with a lack of will to cooperate from the authorities, which by now we're not really surprised by anymore, and to release relevant documents. And in our endeavor to investigate, we soon came across the gap in the evidence, as seen above. In the documents produced by governmental oversight bodies, which are there to regulate and monitor police, the police watching the police, it stated, and in reference to the police violence that occurred, that no form of oversight was established, or, and I quote, the PPB, the Portland Police Bureau, did not produce and apparently did not track an inventory of munitions or daily count of the type of and amount of force used against individuals. Which, when you look at the videos and you speak to people that were on the ground, is really, outrageous and leaves you somewhat speechless, because, it was a statement that, in light of the long-lasting protests and heavy violence, kind of makes you wonder who and by whom and how police is regulated. But this is also the statement that forms somewhat the beginning of our investigation, the gap in the evidence that we wanted to fill. So together with activists, organizers, and lawyers on the ground, we kind of started to assemble a counter archive in the apparent absence of the actual archive, the records of what the police has used and how many munitions they used, and also what type of munitions they used, as they started to deploy all different forms of chemical weapons and tear gas, military-grade vapors in an urban landscape where there was a lot of civilians that engaged in protest, which is their civil right and constitutional right to do so. So what you can see here is the work of the Portland-based grassroots Chemical Weapons Research Center, which were really activists on the ground that started recovering remains of nearly 50 types of so-called less lethal riot control munitions, which is kind of like the euphemistic term for tear gas and tear gas grenades that were deployed by the Portland police, by the PPB and federal law enforcement. In order to understand the use of tear gas, which was kind of the objective of our investigation, and this like chemical iteration of police violence, we need to understand what was used, right? We need to understand how they functions and work together with experts to build an understanding and how really what different types of tear gas there is and how could we really understand what was being used. So in Portland, we needed a methodology to distinguish between all these different types of munitions that were fired indiscriminately and at protesters. And we came up with a research method that really looked at something which is also one of the main fields of expertise in which I work. Is kind of more the maybe like classic investigative journalistic work or textual research, where we combine different forms of documentation and documents to kind of weave together the information that we need. So here on the left you see the forced data collection report, which is like one which basically are the police reports that the police are required by law to produce to monitor their own actions, which ironically was forced on the Portland Police Bureau after the Department of Justice had sued the police office in Portland because they were already known in 2010 or around the 2010s to be extremely violent, to have an extreme outrageous record of racialized police violence and racialized police violence in custody. So they were sued, and as part of the settlement in court, they were required to reform police and establish oversight. The other aspect that we were looking at was to kind of like build an archive and look into the munitions that we found, also looking at videos, and in the middle you see the technical data sheets that we were able to request and retrieve from the manufacturers that produce the less lethal riot control munitions, the chemical weapons in tins, basically chemical violence in tins, shot at police at anti-police protesters. And on the right side, you see requests that we made through public information requests, and the police had to release all their invoices of what they were. What they basically bought. So we kind of like started stitching together an image of, or like an understanding of how we could understand what was used, how much was used, why it was used, and started collecting it together, creating a massive data sheet, linking it together with the visual pieces of evidence. We were sent hundreds and hundreds of videos that we classified around location, in GPS data, but also where in the area of town it happened, what is seen in it, what kind of police unit is involved in it, to really create kind of like a massive database from the videos that we were able to receive, to start matching them with the information that we had. For the context, this is satellite imagery of downtown Portland, which with some of these places marked that were kind of like the focal point of these protests. You have the Justice Center, you have the Townhouse, you have the U.S. District Court, federal law enforcement agencies, you have the City Hall, all places that are kind of, the places where protesters gathered, but also places where police came to suppress and brutalize these protesters. And we were sent videos like these, videos of scenes in the streets where protesters are brutalized, being shot at, And you can kind of see how we started to start matching them together in a process that we call video synchronization, kind of bringing all the different snippets of videos together that we've gathered beforehand and understand really what videos show the same scene at the same time in the same location, using a video software, editing software, and putting them in kind of like layers above one another, using cues in the landscape, seeing specific cars move, and really being able to match them together. To kind of follow to a process that we then were able to kind of locate exactly where the video took place that was filming the police brutality, and we can see kind of starting here matching that this is helicopter footage we retrieved from news agency, and could kind of match the yellow to rectangular onto the map and start building kind of like this map of visibility of what from the specific night. We were choosing a specific night, June the 2nd, which was kind of like the first night in which unprecedented amounts of tear gas were used, and we really started to build a record of what we were able to see from the visual record. And with this we started to also understand in what videos do we see the detonation of munitions, because we were looking into tear gas use, right? So tear gas is usually shot from grenade launches or thrown, and usually it's ignited with a bright flash. And we started to mark also different forms of vapor. We started seeing vapor in all different forms, plumes and smoke grenades, really in all different colors, and kind of like also build a library to understand how could we match different forms of chemical weapons to its initial grenade. And by informing more and more, informing the imagery that we see, we kind of could reveal and retrieve more and more these patterns. So we were here, this is, for example, we could understand that there is a specific pattern of launching a munition. It has a first bright flash, it has another flash and breaks into 3 different subparts. So we could start to understand like different patterns of what was used and could match them to the munitions, just by kind of virtue of understanding the visual pattern of how these munitions explode. And this one is actually the one of the munition sheet that I showed in the middle, which is the triple chaser grenade, one of the most notorious tear gas grenade that US law enforcement, but also law enforcement all around the world use to suppress protests, and one of the most potent ones. And we started to slowly put this information into a model. First, a very rudimentary model, tried to like locate the specific point of detonation of these grenades, and started plotting them into a very preliminary model and categorizing them across a sheet with timestamps, what grenade exploded when at this very night, at June the 2nd, Tear Gas Tuesday, how it was called in Portland local history, and really start to understand and classify. Every single color stands for specific munition type at a specific place and a specific time, to understand really what was used and throughout time. Because what we did with this data, we further developed our model and made it more refined, and could import data such as weather data, meteorological data, traffic movement, where did protesters move, all features that kind of inform how the plume and kind of how the clouds of smoke and tear gas floats through the city. Because what we wanted to understand is not only how it was used, but also how much. Because it is a chemical, and it's a chemical weapon. Actually, tear gas is banned from being used in all forms of interstate warfare. So, it would be a war crime to use tear gas grenades in a war between armies. But law enforcement agents around the world can use it to shoot at their own civilians, which are seemingly there to protect for. So we started to refine more and more our understanding of the very first image that we saw, like one of this video that we had, to understand what do we actually see here. We see vapor, we see people being shot at, which are kind of like violations that happen, that are recorded, but kind of really started to plotting them into a model, marking every single different munition type, where it's detonated, and could locate them within the model to understand what type of munition was used, and could kind of create a digital model in which we measured the release of the chemicals to understand what was the threshold of what was used. So we could kind of develop a tool that would actually enable us to recreate the night and recreate the use of the dispersal of these munitions and also of the chemicals. And you could see kind of like the release that we modeled in this model, specifically flying through this cube in which we were able to measure kind of like the density and the concentration, which really led us to recreate the night in terms of, we can see here the timeline moving forward, all the different incidents and the different munitions, and really start recreating the plume, the cloud of tear gas that flows through the city, which is also at first visible and kind of like it sometimes comes with a smoke plume, but really there is like a long-term effect of these. Sometimes these chemicals stay up to various hours in the ground, sometimes even more, as they fly up and deposit on the ground and kind of like toxify the area. And with this method we were really able to understand different instances, so that we started with during the second, where we could see kind of like the pattern reoccurring, right? There was police using these types of munition throughout the summer and later on even up to 2021, and they continued to use it. So this is kind of a way to develop kind of an understanding that underpins what we can see in the image, and develop our tools and methods to really get the information out that we need to fill specifically the gap, as I was saying, to not have to not be stopped by police or state authorities not really fulfilling their duty and telling what types of violence they applied. So we kind of like used our own tools to understand it, which has led to this investigation was first published with international media in Guardian. It's now part of a big exhibition in Portland, where we really bring together activists, community organizers from the ground to also assemble a critical space in which people can reflect on what happened and kind of like start activating again and think about what are kind of like pathways to legal accountability, but also other forms of social accountability, and continue conversation around how do we want to be policed? What is security like? What is police there for? And that was kind of like one of the main purposes, and we could really see how we could help with this. But that's it. I would like to go over to Phoebe, who will speak about a similar but yet very different case around police brutality in the Netherlands.
Thank you, Jasper. Yeah, so I'm talking about another case of police brutality, but at an entirely different scale. And I suppose this case really shows how systemic and systematic issues with the police can also register at the scale of a second and at the scale of a body. And so today I'll be talking about a very recent project of ours, the police killing of a young German man, Sammy Baker. Sammy travelled to Amsterdam for his 23rd birthday on the 13th of August 2020. He then entered an unprecedented episode of psychosis, leading to an incident between Sammy and the Dutch police, which entirely mishandled and escalated the situation and ultimately led to them killing Sammy by shooting him to death. It's a horrific case. However, the public prosecutor very quickly dismissed it. And so without any kind of existing routes to legal action, we were invited and asked by Sammy's family to investigate the case. So I'm going to start with a video. This video is of the moment that Sammy is killed. And I start with this video as an introduction to the event itself, but also to show you the kind of material we're working with. So a witness on a balcony of the courtyard recorded this video and captured this evidence of Sammy being killed. There were also several other videos that recorded the moments leading up to Sammy's death. And this has enabled us to reconstruct these crucial moments of the event in a 3D model, which has produced evidence for cases now against the police officers. This video and all of the videos, I've removed the sound because it's extremely traumatic. I just want to warn you that for the next 20 minutes, it will be focusing on the moments of someone being killed. And so if you think this will be triggering for any reason, I would recommend perhaps leaving and then coming back in 20 minutes. It's not graphic per se, but it's very distressing. So on the evening of the 10th of August, a couple of days before he was shot, Sami smoked and ate cannabis with his friends, which appeared to trigger an unprecedented episode of psychosis. This led Sami to disappear into the city, leaving behind his friends, who then reported him missing. 2 days later, a very distressed Sami was found by his mother, who had travelled to Amsterdam on the news of his disappearance, as well as his friends. A patrolling officer then approached Sami, leading him to flee, still in this state of psychosis. And this led to a chase between Sami and the police officer. And at this moment, Sami took out a very small knife from his pocket, which, according to the officers, he tried to cut himself on the neck and the wrists. A short while later, Sami was then cornered in a courtyard between two residential blocks, trapped by a high fence. He tried to climb the fence, and then the police used pepper spray on him, which is an entire misuse of pepper spray. You should never use it on someone in psychosis. And this escalated Sami's situation and his sense of fear. And by this moment, residents around the courtyard have started filming the scene. So you can see here, Sami is sitting on the floor by the trampoline, entirely cornered by the police officer as well as the fence. And he stays here for about 10 minutes in a stable position that could have easily been de-escalated. He then got up onto his feet, but he still has obviously nowhere to go, being cornered by the police officers. And at this time, Sami is harming himself with a knife. The police officers by now know they're dealing with someone in a state of mental health crisis. And the officers are telling Sami they want to help him, but at the same time, they're pointing their guns at him. Throughout this entire interaction, Sami is denied any medical or psychiatric care. A paramedic had actually arrived on the scene during this kind of status quo 10 minutes, but was never asked to intervene. And according to the police testimony, the officers never even considered using the paramedic. Sami's mother was also nearby, and she wasn't allowed to speak to Sami during this time, even through the fence. So instead, she would stand nearby, waiting until she heard the shots that fatally killed her son. By now, Sami begins to move towards the officers, and he is still unresponsive. The officer in charge claimed in her testimony that she heard that Sami was waving a knife towards the officers, and this was a key reason for them doing what they then did. However, our very simple video analysis here shows that this claim isn't true. The entire time, Sami's arm is not moving. Like the rest of his upper body, his arm and hand were motionless. And even though he's moving very slowly, the officers continually threaten to shoot him. In the meantime, an officer with a police dog approaches Sami from behind. And police dogs in this context are usually used to mitigate danger by biting someone that's seen as a risk. However, it's clear this was an entirely inappropriate use of the dog, not only because he was in a state of psychosis, but also it's attested to the fact that the dog entirely ignored Sami, who was essentially motionless and silent at this time, and instead they went for the police officers who were pointing their guns at Sami. So they were seen as the risk in this situation. And this then pulled the dog handler with him, creating an even more dangerous situation. So as the dog handler approaches Sami, he's entirely motionless, and he's still holding a knife that he's holding at his neck. And this entirely contradicts the dog handler's testimony of the event, who said that Sami was a huge risk in this situation. So because the dog didn't go for Sami, instead the officer decides to push Sami to the ground, and this physical confrontation begins a chaotic sequence of events which ultimately leads to Sami's death. So these three videos capture the time of Sami's death, and by watching them alone, it seems that there isn't any clear evidence of what happened during this time. And so the only evidence so far that was used by the public prosecutor was the testimony of the officers. And this was just entirely accepted by the Dutch public prosecutor without any scrutiny. So the officers said both the victim and the dog handler fell to the ground, that Sami started swinging the knife around wildly immediately after this, that he started stabbing in the direction of my colleague's vest, that I saw and felt that he hit my safety vest with the knife during that. I thought, I have to shoot, I have to protect my colleague. However, our reconstruction of the event through 3D analysis and video analysis really challenges the police account and disproves it in many cases. We used 16 videos for this investigation, which covers about 14 minutes of the incident. And they were recorded from various balconies surrounding the courtyard, which acted as kind of eyes witnessing the scene. And none of these witnesses were then asked for interview after. So as Jasper explained, we use a process called video synchronization. And so we did this to create a timeline of the events of the different videos recorded from the balconies. And we use for this metadata within the videos, but also visual and oral cues to tie it to the real time. And so it creates this quite realistic timeline then of the event. We then analyzed this synced file very closely. So we're looking at the sequence of the time that he was shot, frame by frame, and at certain moments from multiple perspectives. And at first glance, by watching the video, it seemed that Sami's position at the time he was shot is completely obscured by the bushes. But through looking at it in this kind of very precise way, we actually could find details of Sami's body and position. And so this is our limit, essentially, with these videos. It's the frame, which is usually 25 to 30 per second, and then the single pixel. And when we talk about these limits, what we're talking about is the threshold of detectability. And we mean, as AR says here, things that hover between identifiable and not. They leave a chemical signature on the negative but cannot be verified. So in this instance, the chemical signature we're talking about is the video and sound data that capture this event. And the threshold of detectability is the pixel and it's the frame. And there are things that certainly slip under this. So for example, we were trying to understand whether or not you could see the knife during this time and whether he was still holding it in fact. But the knife is too small to be registered by a pixel. So we can't say whether or not he was holding a knife at this time. But something kind of on the threshold of detectability are parts of Sami's body through the bushes. So we can see pixels of his body at this time. And so then we can better understand actually his position. So I've been showing you this kind of like weird selection of pixels and zooming in and slowing down on them. And this is really a crucial part of investigation. And to this, maybe it doesn't really look like much, but soon we'll kind of show you our 3D modeling somehow that came out of this. We basically identified a series of pixels moving at the time he was shot. And in first instance, by watching the video alone, it seemed like it was an arm. But further investigation showed us actually it was a leg. And this really significantly changed our understanding of Sami's position at the time he was shot and whether or not actually he was a risk and danger to the police officers. So to better understand the videos and to be able to kind of analyze them further, we created a 3D model of the incident, reconstructing parts of the event temporally and spatially. And we've used this, and we use always very precise 3D models. This one was through a process of photogrammetry using drone footage. And then we place vegetation, objects, people into this model through a process called photo matching. And this essentially replicates the position, angle, focal length of an image frame within the digital model. So it basically puts the video back in or the photo back into the 3D model. And we do the same with videos through a process called camera tracking. And for this incident, we tracked 3 videos at the time he was shot that I showed you earlier. And we used these to really carefully reconstruct the locations of the officer and Sami during this time. Now, the issue in this case is precisely Sami's body position at the time he was shot and to understand whether or not he was in a dangerous position to the officers. And this was justification from the police of killing Sami, basically. And so for this investigation, Sami's body became a key piece of evidence for disproving the testimonies of the police officers. And so we modeled it extremely carefully from information from photographs and autopsy reports. And working with the human body in this way really kind of blurs the idea of the body as evidence between the object and subject within the courtroom. And this quote is looking at a very famous case of Mengeles' skull, which really shaped the current practice of forensic bodily evidence in courtrooms. And Eyal has this quote that says, "Human remains are the kind of objects from which the trace of the subject cannot be fully removed. Their appearance and presentation in the courts of law and public opinion has in fact blurred something of the distinction between objects and subjects, evidence and testimony." So in the case of the model of Sami Baker, his body became a key testimony of the violence that it was subjected to. So we had to read his body as a way of understanding this violence using our specialist spatial tools. And so for this, we carefully analysed and cross-referenced various autopsy reports, which we then consolidated into the model of Sami, translating the confusing hundreds of pages reports into clear depictions of his injuries. And in this sense, the body became a holder of the evidence, it became the evidence, and it also became testimony. But I suppose I also want to say about the kind of objectification of a body within a courtroom obviously poses kind of ethical questions about the representation of someone that can't give you consent to represent it. And it's always a big topic within our work, and we have a lot of discussions about it. And we wouldn't ever do something uninvited. So Sami's family invited us to work on this case, asked us to produce evidence, and for this we had to use his body in this way. But it's always kind of a very difficult ethical question that we are facing. So we mapped the gunshot paths, which were critical in helping us understand the relative position of Sami to the officers who fired the shots. And the autopsy report describes 3 shot paths. Shot path 1 begins at Sami's upper right arm. Shot path 2 goes through his body from the right side to the left. And shot path 3 is in his left arm that ends really by the entrance point, as you can see here. However, our findings suggest that it's overwhelmingly likely that shot path 2 and shot path 3 are actually part of the same shot. And this is why the bullet ended so close actually to the entrance hole in the left arm. And this is supported by supplementary forensic opinions and also independent forensic firearm specialists that we consulted. And this finding was really essential actually to our understanding of Sami Baker's position at the time of him being shot. As for the 2 shot paths to be part of the same shot, he would have had to be in a hunched over position like this. And also we know from the other shot paths that the 2 firing officers were largely on his right side and behind him at the time, and he was in a kind of hunched over position similar to this. And so from the shot path analysis, we could actually then place Sami's body in his position at the time of him being shot. We also worked with sound experts who analysed the audio captured in the videos and could give us more information about which officer shot which and things like this, as well as evidence from firearm reports. And so we ended up with this kind of matrix of evidence, all of these ingredients of evidence that we then brought into the 3D model. And this is what we were talking about earlier about an operative model becoming the kind of container of evidence and one that can expand the evidence itself. So going back into the 3D analysis at the moment right before Sami is shot, 3 officers claimed that when Sami fell to the ground, the dog handler fell with him. And they claimed this was why they all closed in on him as they did. However, our video analysis shows this isn't true, and the dog handler remained standing throughout the incident. Our reconstruction also shows that Sami fell on his back with his arms near to his head and neck at this time. And this is when the officers rushed towards him, surrounding him. Even though no officers were in danger, they could have stepped back rather than stepped towards him at any time, and then they would have just removed themselves from risk. Now, this is the last time we see Sami in the videos before he is shot. Our digital reconstruction suggests this is the leg, and this has enabled us to be able to position Sami during this time. And also from another angle, we see an officer who said he tried to grab Sami's arm bending down, and this has also helped us to be able to position him. There's then a 1.1 second period before the time of the first shot, from the moment that the officer let go of Sami's arm to the moment that he's shot. And during this time, Sami and the 2 officers that fired the shots aren't visible to the camera. There's a moment during this time that 2 officers leap back, and this suggests that whatever action led to the officers shooting Sami happened at this moment. Now, we can't see Sami's position during this time, so we don't know whether or not he did stab towards the officer's vest, as he claimed. However, we do know from our reconstruction that throughout this period, Sami's overall position didn't change. And so he remains on his back with his arms and legs in the air, with no other officers around him. The officers could have at any moment stepped back and they'd remove themselves from danger. This is the time of shot 1, and at this moment we actually see Sami captured in the footage, and our spatial reconstruction suggests that what we see are his knee and arm, with one of the shooters in position to shoot. And so this is his likely position at shot 1. Only half a second later are the times of shot 2 and 3, and these happened almost instantaneously, so we know that both of the shooters that actually shot Sami were shooting at this moment. At this time we see Sami's leg in the video, and together his leg position and the possible shot paths suggest that his torso hasn't moved substantially and that he's in a position similar to this at this time. And we don't see the fourth shot at all, as all of the cameras have dropped by then, which is a natural response to hearing gunshots. However, very shortly after Sami is killed, we do see his legs and feet. And taken together with information from the pathology reports, these observations indicate the body position of Sami when he was shot. He was lying on his back with his legs above his waist, leaning on his left arm. He was not in an aggressive stance when the shots were fired, and any of the officers could have stepped back at any moment and removed themselves from danger. So to reach these conclusions that we've presented as a very kind of linear story, it was a very rigorous methodology of spatial testing and investigation. And this is just one example kind of to show this. So throughout the sequence, if Sami's torso had been further from the ground during the period of the shots, you would have clearly been visible in the video. And so together, our combination of video analysis and spatial reconstruction has enabled us to really construct this evidence that contradicts the testimony of the police officers. We show, firstly, that the officers' conduct before Sami's death exacerbated the situation rather than de-escalating it. The dog handler did not fall to the ground with Sami. He did not wave his knife towards the officers as he walked towards them. And in the moment immediately before Sami's death, he was not in a position that was threatening to the officers. So if the officers had taken a step back at any time, they could have removed themselves from the potential danger, and therefore there is no justification that they shot him. And so really here we've kind of produced this evidence, we've produced facts, and for us this just kind of goes back to what our work is essentially about, the production of facts. We go back to this quote often by Lorraine Dustin because it really describes the making of facts well. She says, "Facts are often faint and flickering. They are the achievement of subtle investigations that must painstakingly stabilize evanescent effects or ingeniously combine several strands of evidence into a strong, weight-bearing cord. Above all, as their etymology suggests, the most interesting and useful facts are not given but made, artifacts in the best sense of the word." So really here we've zoomed into the construction of facts, focusing on the detail, on the pixel, on the threshold of detectability, showing how this can really act as a needle, creating an intricate cut through legal and media environments surrounding the case. And thinking back to the original term forensis being a space that combines both politics and law, the evidence we've created for the Sami Baker case is existing in both of these forums and interplaying between them and bringing them back together somehow, generating new legal political forums itself. It will support Sami's family in a case against the police officers, whilst also in the political advocacy realm, it's beginning to contribute to a much needed conversation around policing in the Netherlands, especially around mental health crises. And now I hand back to Jasper for a few kind of closing words.
Yes, thank you all. Thanks for sticking around. I know it's probably, it's difficult things to watch. And yeah, it really forms kind of like the basis of the materials that we work with, but also speak to the reality in which we situate ourselves, in which we live. And so both of the investigations also show kind of how we really operate across geographies, temporalities, and scales from the body and the second, such as Sami Baker, to the scale of the cities and the temporalities of days, weeks, and even months of protests. It also, in this way, speaks to the versatility of localities in which systemic violence and of police brutality manifests itself. It speaks also to the need to activating our work, right? Like the last slide that Phoebe was showing about, it's like it's not only about producing the fact, but it's about activating these facts, about bringing them, they have to be seen. So once facts are constructed and truths are assembled, these facts need to circulate and get activated. In other words, they need to be presented and seen. often we're approached by people that ask us for help, such as the lawyers, the activists and organizers from Portland, or the family of Sammy Baker. And it's usually the preferred way of how we're working. We're working on behalf of and investigate with communities of victims and that have been, have experienced violence. So it's often people that we're working with that have already been disenfranchised and pushed to the margins of societal discourse and are battling to have their voices heard. So our techniques and method then are not only a way of providing more technical expertise to scrutinize the actions of the state, but really breaking the state privilege, its monopoly over forensic inquiry, but also its methods to assemble the critical spaces in which we exchange and kind of like start to communicate with the communities and building these communities of resistance and solidarity. Spaces that serve as counterweights to hegemonic discourse, and the hegemonic public that has already disregarded the right to be seen, heard, and granted due legal process, but also in legal, but also discursive and social terms. So it is a method of creating critical spaces for collective investigative power that, especially in times of shrinking public spaces, has become ever more important, which also speaks to the reason of why we're here today and why we think it's important to speak and continue assuming these spaces and maintaining these critical spaces of rising police brutality, also especially here in Germany, against Palestinians in recent months and those that stand up in solidarity, but also to other people that are othered, have been marginalized, and thereby made into seemingly legitimate targets of such racialized police brutality, to continue this work to build alliances. It's this weaving of expertise, of theory and practice that marks our very practice. It's also then a creation of the needed counterweight in the political struggle over representation and the right and capacity to visibility and the fight over who is able to shape and circulate facts. Or in other words, we create the new forums in which we strive to speak truth and push towards accountability on the factual basis of our investigations, a forum that through its presence is the very practice of assembling counterpublics. These are spaces for voices that work against injustices and are collectively achieved by coming together and producing the needed evidence to ensure visibility, constructed against systemic imperatives that are primed to invisibilize invisibilize the facts, and those facts need to be defended in blossoming regimes of disinformation. Our forums are counterpublics that enable and interlink between methods and technical expertise with the situated experiences of individuals and communities brutalized by and rising in resistance to the publics that silence them, and with those we stand in solidarity. Thank you very much for listening and for inviting all of us.
Wow.
Perfect.
That was crazy, huh?
I think we will have to share the mic.
Yeah, we can.
This was very intense. I'm really moved. So I would like to start. Microphone is on? Yes. So first of all, thank you for this presentation. In particular, the second part was very intense. How do you? I was wondering while listening to you, like how do you keep your sanity in this process as an investigator? How do you, as basic as how do you take care of yourself in working with putting such facts together? Because I felt myself like my chest getting heavier and heavier while listening and watching. So how do you guys manage? You just said these are the realities we live in, but this is just quite a reality show nonetheless for most of us.
Yeah, go. I mean, yeah, it's difficult, right? I think the way that you stay sane is by working with these communities and with these individuals and seeing kind of hope within these cases, you know? You get approached when someone feels that there's really nothing that can be done and when people are somehow losing all hope in a case. And then by kind of doing the work, you're seeing this glimmer of hope somehow sometimes, be relightened somehow, you know? And I think this is really what enables you to kind of keep going with the work, and work with this very difficult these difficult subjects, of course. Also kind of having care with each other, I suppose, and as a kind of practice in this way is obviously very important. But sure, I mean, I think there's always a question of becoming desensitized to these things, right? And how to kind of like be desensitized enough so that you can do the work and so that you can work in the service of others, whilst also always kind of remaining human within the cases and still having this kind of very human touch and approach towards these content matters and never becoming out of it. Because as a researcher within these cases, you can't somehow remove yourself from these situations. You become very embedded within these cases.
Yeah, and maybe also to that point, what you were saying, I really agree. I was actually this weekend at the Gorki Theatre, where the Initiative 19. Februar, together with the creative directors and theatre people, presented a piece on Hanau and the racist terror attack of Hanau, which is about to have its 4th anniversary. It was one of the first cases that Forensis took on here in Germany, to work with the community. And I think kind of the experience that I had there is sitting there, and I was with one of my dear colleagues, Dimitra, who's worked very closely on the case and knows the people quite well. And it's really also kind of sitting there and seeing at the same time the anger that comes with this, and the anger of like state failure and how we felt, and kind of like how what violence exists and what violence people have to endure like for generations. At the same time, seeing kind of like community within this and a kind of a defiance in that, and I think this is really what also drives me and what makes us continue the work.
And I'm sure there's many questions. I'll ask two more maybe, and then I'll pass the mic to you guys. Where to start? Another thing I was thinking about, so you're a group of experts, no, from very different fields. So basically I have two questions. Which one do I start with? Let's start with one that I was interested in. You're a group of experts. You're a trained architect. You're a trained anthropologist. You come together, work on these cases. But is there also something that you can offer, or do you consider offering, let's say to us, let's say we come in a similar situation, something like tools or DIY, so to speak, to how to react? And I'm telling this because I have a personal history where a family member of mine was in a demonstration and was kind of arrested by the police, and they claimed that he hit a police officer, which he didn't do. But then he kind of was inspired by forensic architecture, and together with a friend, they went on Twitter and to look for that moment and found, I think, 4 different Twitter videos, and they were able to remake basically the whole setting with also camera view from here, from there, the time, etc. And they're smart, so they're smart kids, and they brought it to trial. And he was not pleaded guilty, anything, he got out. But if he wouldn't have had this, he would have been seriously screwed. There was also police officers, they had their stories, which were completely made up, basically, because he was not even in the scene of the setting. But if he wouldn't have had this edited video, he would have truly been tried. So is there something, any kind of tools, DIYs that you kind of usually pass along, advices for, general public in situations like this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's also a huge part of what we do. We're trying to create tools and create methods for holding accountability towards the state and the police that then we share with other people. And all the software we use, most of the software anyway we use is completely open source software, so anyone can use it. And we try and share the way that we do this as openly as possible, so that others can. And they indeed do. We get a lot of kind of messages from people as well that are telling us they're kind of using these methods. And so this is really also central, because we don't just want to be doing it ourselves, but we want to create this kind of collective public truth making. And this is really about sharing these kind of tools of accountability. So for sure, Yeah,
I think there's an array of sense. I mean, also I think we're indebted to a field of kind of like open source practitioners that really started kind of, and I was pointing at that a bit, like with a shift towards the omnipresence of the audiovisual that we have. Everyone has cameras, everyone has camera on their phones, quite high resolution by now. And I think some of the start of the practice really comes from kind of around the beginning of the Arab Spring, but also then later on, like really tracking airstrikes and human rights violations in war, kind of around, mostly focusing on Syria, but also other conflicts. And then also other protest movements, where really it was mostly people, that were on Twitter, like really scratching the videos, saving them, trying to plot them and understand. So there is a huge open source investigator community out there, but it's awesome. We've moved on now, maybe like 14 years from that moment. Of course, you get specialized, you become experts, or expertise is kind of like more like channeled. And we really, as Phoebe was saying, kind of try to disperse. This is also one of the reasons why we came to Berlin, from London to Berlin, to kind of create within the investigative commons a place in which we want to disperse these methods, work with civil society actors from around. And then of course there's the very like few things that you can do is film the police, try to stay vigilant, right, and like try to document things in these ways, because you realize that they do try to twist stories in their own favor sometimes, or more often than not.
Then it's all onto you. My last question is, since this is also a lecture series about kind of transdisciplinary cultural production in the widest sense, or truth production, could you briefly, both of you, you're visual anthropology, philosophy, and journalism, so that's your background, you come from architecture, but what kind of skill set did both of your studies bring into the game that you're applying now? Can you pinpoint that?
Me? Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, coming from architecture, I have a kind of spatial understanding, which is fundamental for this work. But I suppose I was never so interested in kind of designing buildings as much. And then I also went into kind of critical design, so really understanding design as a kind of critical tool, and a critical way, a critical approach for kind of research. And I suppose that kind of framing was really crucial. And then, of course, the kind of practical, the side of things you learn. I mean, it's a hugely kind of technical process, right? But I think anyone can learn technical skills, right? So I think it helps having an architecture background, but really the skills are there for people to learn. All of the skills we're doing are kind of somewhere that you can learn it.
I guess for me it's a bit less clear-cut in a way. There's a few. Most of the people that work in the both offices come from architectural design background, but more and more it gets diversified, and there's like sometimes project-specific expertise that comes in, like people that are more well-versed in like cartographic analysis, but also sometimes, of course, lawyers, sometimes journalists. And for me, it was mostly kind of like an interest I always kind of sought out. I was studying philosophy of political science, and then visual anthropology, and it was always, I kind of took a bit of there was a bit of a discomfort that sat with me about the distance between the academic research and the university, and really always tried to like look how to directly apply it, and was working mostly in like human rights documentation, more like grassroots activism on like the EU border violence monitoring, tracking, and there was kind of like the classic process that happened kind of like throughout the field. And you were receiving testimonies of people on the move, refugees that were being brutalized at the EU borders, but also more and more they would just hand over their phone and say like, well, just look for yourself. We have the phones, we have the GPS, we were on EU territory, we have a right to asylum, or at least being granted a legal process. So it was really also understanding kind of like how that field shifted. And then for me it was kind of combining the two, understanding really how testimonies and written evidence kind of like intersects with the visual, kind of also what the presentation was about. So it's a bit of more of a versatile skill set. But that sometimes also, and also specifically here in Germany, was more about understanding a bit more like maybe the political field. and to think about how and where we can activate our stories, and how, as I said, kind of like circulate the facts till they're seen.
And now, finally you, and then all of you, you can ask the question. I have to repeat it for the online audience. You can just say it. The cable is not long enough. Just speak loud.
Which is one of like an ongoing Palestinians. I can't help but feel, looking at all of this, a sense of deep irony, bitterness, futility, not because the work is not urgent or important. I think on the contrary, like we need it very much, but more so because we're in a moment characterized by an overwhelming flood of proof and evidence and images, and yet characterized by a response here, like within the German mainstream, that is at best one of denial or apathy, or at worst one of cheering for the genocide and supporting it fully. And so
maybe also come to your question.
I think about this also in relation to the statement that came out of this institution 2 days ago, which not only failed to mention anything about Palestinians, there's no mention of them at all, which is like the highest level of dehumanization, knowing that more than 30,000 have been killed and then tens of thousands maimed and starved and displaced. But there's a denial of the fact that it's a settler colonial project and an apartheid state altogether. So my question is, how do we then, in light of such a political moment and such a response within the context that we're in, think about proof, truth, evidence, and the image? Thank you.
There's a long comment or reflection on the current political situation you're facing in Gaza, in Israel, and the Near East. To make very clear, this is a talk about forensic architecture and their work, and this is another debate that we had 2 weeks ago, and we can have another point. So it's very... yes, exactly. I'm just saying, let's give everyone a chance to ask questions, that we don't end up only talking about this. This is the key point for me. No, yeah. But anyways, so to repeat the question is like, how can you deal with the current situation? I think you referred in both of your comments to it in the context that we're in right now.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think it's super important, and thanks for bringing it up. I think you're really hitting a point that also we in our practice, kind of have grappled with in the last month. I personally have been, deeply moved by the response of our team. For context, kind of like the cradle of forensic architecture is understanding the logics and the violence of the occupation. And we work very closely with people on the ground. We've lost many people, dears and loved ones of members of our team. And it really, touched all of us and also brought us to exactly these questions of who's this for? Sometimes we produce investigations and we sometimes feel like, well, we're just repeating or kind of confirming what people already know. Which is a hard question, and it's difficult, and yet we kind of, at least I personally, of how I understand and interpret this practice, is kind of like of channeling it to the places in which people have been disenfranchised to be in, right? So to have kind of like, have these really like the facts activated, you need to speak in many ways a certain form of legal language, a visual language, that we tried to assist with. Not always at our best capacity, but we try. And in light of the ongoing war we've come to our kind of like we've touched exactly on these questions of how can we provide aid and kind of like accountability. We're working on various different fronts with people on the ground documenting specifically strikes on hospitals. We've published our work over the last months about this, but also we had conversations in our office about what to do here in Berlin. And that's also why we thought it was good to speak about police brutality, because we can see rising police brutality. And this is also where we wanted to respond through our work and kind of continue our efforts here to document this. And of course the question remains of who are you documenting this, right? Sometimes we think we just need to document it for history, for archives. And that's sometimes it feels futile, but sometimes that's what you need for accountability later on, right? Transitional reparative justice. But it's a very fair question, and it's one that maybe unfortunately I can't fully answer, because it's questions that we continue throughout in our practice. But maybe you want to add to something, or
I don't know what else to add, but just thank you for that statement and that question. For the last couple of months, our organisation has been having the exact same questions consistently, and it's been something we're battling with constantly. As I said in the opening, how impossible it is, right, navigating these conversations, and how to kind of, I suppose today, how to protect the space to be able to talk about anti-fascism whilst working within this context is just like mind-boggling. Right? Like how we want to have these conversations, but how we have to kind of negotiate in this difficult sphere to be able to still kind of keep forums open to talk about anti-police, anti-fascism. It's something we're negotiating constantly, and we have no real answers. But yeah, I thank you for your statement.
Hard for follow-up, but there's a question behind there.
How do you get funding for your practice?
Nice, completely switch.
It's another reality. The question was, how do you get funding? How do you sustain your practice?
And actually the questions are somehow quite tied, aren't they? Do you want to go? You're Mr. Funding.
Mr. Funding. Well, yeah, I actually do try to get money for our practice. It's a tough time. It's kind of both. It's actually it's also something that we realize. Germany is a place in which there's a lot of public funding, but it increasingly comes with conditions that are sometimes impossible to navigate, and we reject. We always worked on the condition that we wanted to do our work freely without the conditions tied where the money comes from, and we've done this through various ways. Forensic Architecture in London is a research agency, but linked to the university. So we get academic funding grants for academic research, public money, but also more and more, or like from different channels, mostly from foundations that fund critical democratic or human rights work. There's a lot of trusts that fund cross-border investigative journalism, where we also fund under, especially in the work of coordinating journalists and investigators in different conflict zones. So it's really an array, but also, and you mentioned this in the beginning, that sometimes often actually we also get, we put our work into exhibitions, not only for actually creating an audience, because when we post stuff online and operate or like collaborate with international media or national media, we operate in a kind of in a digital space with an insane attention span, and our investigations are very complex, and we need the time to explain it. We actually don't want to subdue to the pressure of putting things into 7 seconds, because it reduces the complexity of the violence that exists. And we actually realized that galleries and museums are spaces in which we can operate well, because people bring sometimes an hour and a half, 2 hours of time. But it also ties to funding. Sometimes the arts, and maybe ties to this lecture series as well, right? The artistic practice is also space for critical reflection, and also, in many cases sometimes come with less conditions, or actually more freedom to actually do your work, because they're not so, they want to actually ensure the critical capacity of the arts, right? So we really operate kind of like on the intersection of these fields, and wherever we can get the money, we then try to shift our focus towards that. I mean, not wherever we can get the money, but kind of if it's academic money, we develop our methods with this. If we're commissioned for an exhibition, we want to use that space and use the money to platform people that otherwise don't have the platform. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, funding is a deeply political practice, right? So it's not easy kind of negotiating the funding of it. I'd also say that the Sammy Baker case was actually crowdfunded. And this was part of trying to raise its status and try to raise awareness around it, that we launched a kind of public crowdfunding campaign for it.
We have a question, but Jakob first, then you.
I just have a comment, which is like, I'm sorry, it's funny, but the questions were like, you know, Instagram posts where you see the dead people, dead children, and then it comes like clothes and shoes advertisement, how we change the subject, and then also getting grants. We have to be careful if it comes from Germany. What do you talk about when you go in a university, how open you are about this subject. And this is very tough that we are very careful right now to talk, which I recognize. I don't know, I just feel really angry, and then, I don't know. Please. It was just...
So maybe tying into the question before, do you guys see yourselves mainly as artists, activists, journalists, or as investigators, perhaps neutral investigators of the truth, whatever it may be? You said that that sometimes your work is commissioned, and it seems that there could be a conflict of interest. So how do you deal with informational gaps? Because your mode of presentation suggests that your 3D models represent reality beyond doubt. So I would like to know, how do you deal with potential errors? And connecting to that, in what ways, if any, do you think your work improves upon the legal process in a court of law?
I'm very thankful that I don't have to repeat that question, because that would have been difficult.
Maybe I can start. Jump in whenever you want to. Thanks for the question. So it's kind of where do I start with this question? So basically, maybe to the first question of like, how do we deal with errors that occur? We have a practice of being very upfront if errors occur. We share these publicly, and we adjust our findings accordingly. It hasn't happened a lot, but especially in times of, we've kind of like shifted modes due to the unfolding situation in Israel-Palestine to live conflict monitoring, and we work in very different temporalities. Sometimes our projects take years, usually it's like between 6 months to a year, maybe a bit less sometimes. Sammy Baker case was actually quite short, because of course we want to give time for rigorous kind of like cross-checking and fact-checking. In regards to conflict of interests, we make sure that the money we get comes without the conditions that would create conflict of interest. We reject a lot of funds or a lot of money that would be otherwise maybe available, either by our own, or like in terms of reject, we choose to not apply for it because we know what comes with it. Specifically also in regards to the comment that you raised just now, when it's public money, which is actually sad to see, because in theory, in a more ideal state, this public money should be for public good, right, and not linked to state ideology. It's our money. It's the money that the society allocates for critical research as such. And if we really take it seriously, what it means to live, like an open, free, and critical society, then this money should be there to investigate the errors of the society, right? And in terms of the 3D model, maybe this is something that you want to respond to. What I can say, from kind of like the conception of truth that we have. For us, it's really around this idea of collective truth and truth activation. So assemble the facts where there are no facts, or where facts have been kind of like made to be disappeared. And our models, maybe this is something that you can speak to, of course, is kind of a representation of it, or like an approximation. But it's also not the only place, right? Like the models are kind of the container in which different informations come together. So we kind of try to make sure that it's not only that.
Can you repeat the question about the models so I can answer it specifically?
So it was more like, because of course we do represent facts, but sometimes there are gaps. For example, if all the footage available, there's either like a temporal gap between frames, or you just, there's a visual gap. So, because I took from your presentation that you are trying to fill in these gaps. And as I just understood, Jasper, that you are very open about when some pieces of information is missing. So how do you represent that in your 3D models, if at all? And but also the final question, in what ways, if any, do you think your work improves upon the legal process?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how we represent facts. And I think, of course, when you see a model that looks highly precise, you kind of with it have associated that it's completely truthful and factual, and there's really this kind of like aesthetic question over the representation generally of facts and kind of simulations and things. I suppose what we try and do is kind of show how facts are created, how they're constructed, how they're not something that's just given or immediate, as we said, but how they're kind of created through this negotiation of different things. And then with the aesthetics, I suppose it's an interesting one, because at one point we want to somehow kind of show our findings, show the fact as it is, but we also somehow want to kind of like question the aesthetics of facts themselves and kind of question the believability and reliability of a representation of something. So by kind of clearly showing that our renderings, our models, and kind of the back of our analysis is a construction, it also somehow kind of like questions you to think about when you see something like a rendering, like a simulation. Is that truthful? Should I trust it? Like, who made this? It's kind of somehow tried to reshape and make us rethink about what we consider as facts and how to produce facts.
Thank you. Max, 2 questions. Another question from the audience. Yes.
How do your findings hold up in court, and how do you bring them to court?
How do your findings hold up in court, and how do you bring them to court?
Well, it's actually it's a good question, because maybe a little anecdote. Like in some of the cases, realizing that we're moving kind of at the edge of what has been used so far as evidence, and specifically visual and highly technical pieces of evidence. There's colleagues of ours had come to courtrooms and they have to bring their own TV screen because the courtroom still didn't have actually the capacity to show visual piece of evidence. So yeah, there is a bit of like a need to reform things, but this is also where we try to push, right? We try to push what is admissible. The admissibility of facts or evidence in court is a highly procedural undertaking. You have to present all things. They have to be admissible. They have to be kind of like videos have to be in a specific file form. So it's really hard to sometimes bring them in. But if we do manage, it's been kind of a mixed box of how they hold up in court. Sometimes they're actually dismissed on procedural grounds because certain things are not right, as some prosecutors have said, especially here in Germany. Was not necessarily court, but the special investigative inquiry of the Hessischer Landtag around Hanau. There was actually, you can see how there's actually kind of concerted effort to not let our evidence come to court or to come to this public hearing. It was not really a court. And legal admissibility is very narrow. And sometimes we produce videos and then have to translate them into 60 pages PDF reports and kind of refer to the video. So it's really still, it's moving, but also members of our practice, our director sits in the advisory council of the International Criminal Court to kind of really push what can be seen as evidence, what is evidence, how it's admissible. But we also, it kind of changes from investigation to investigation when we work specifically with lawyers. They also shape how we do our investigations because they maybe need a very specific answer to a specific question, right? So we sometimes play this role of the expert witness, that we bring a certain form of expertise into court that presents a certain finding. So you have to be commissioned by certain, by kind of like the defendants or state prosecutor. We don't work with states, so usually defendants. So yeah, there's a bit of a change. And also when we work around, we often work, as Phoebe was saying, we work with the ECCHR, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, which are kind of like an activist human rights firm or center here in Berlin, which have also quite creative ways of how to bring things into court and how actually to also use the court. Sometimes they don't want to fight the full case, but actually have kind of like legal intervention strategies that kind of like pick together legal strategies with human rights strategies, advocacy, so to kind of like bring them together and kind of really outbalance if certain pieces of evidence are not available or admissible in court. But did Sammy go to court?
It's going to court, yeah. I suppose also, we've kind of shown you one level of the backstage, partially today, of like how we construct this evidence. And then there's the kind of further level, which is maybe the methodology report. So for each case, we produce a kind of weighty methodology report that very clearly shows all of our methods and sets out everything. It kind of like tries to somehow translate it into what they would consider a scientific practice. And this kind of talks, I suppose, about the kind of science of forensics generally and our kind of construction of a new type of forensics, and it has to obviously be kind of verified and verifiable in some way, and so we have to be extremely open with kind of the limits of what we're doing, the thresholds and everything. It's kind of completely open and honest with this in the methodology report, and very legal somehow in this sense, and kind of dry, but also extremely interesting if you're kind of interested in how facts are somehow constructed.
Final question from you guys? Then I would come to wrap up with my final question and maybe also last reflection. And thanks again for your statement earlier. And that's a general one, what we're questioning here, the futility of things or the bitterness that we do in the University of Arts, whether it's on the current conflict or any other given conflict. And the world is a mess anywhere you look at the moment. And it's a tough one, in particular in the University of Arts. It feels such an academic bubble to understand, is there value behind what I do? I think you offered us a great ways of kind of applying such knowledge. But also maybe in the general room, you don't have to become a political artist, but anything you do is always political. There's nothing that is not political, just the way you interact, you work, you engage, you enter the dialogue. So maybe that's something to take with us, and then maybe also, and I'm trying to connect this now to forensics, there's the Locard rule of like every contact leaves a trace. No? That like that whatever you touch, there's a reciprocal exchange between two objects, two subjects. So I hope that this contact left a trace with you, kind of these sharing of investigations, and I hope that generally kind of this is also what this lecture series was about, to kind of get in touch with very different positions. But coming to my very final question, so last one, you can be quick or long if you like, is do you have a final piece of advice that you would like to share with us?
You go first.
Oh, I don't think I'm really in the position to give any advice. Advice. I think don't feel pigeonholed by a discipline, maybe. Don't feel pigeonholed by a discipline. Maybe this is a very English term. Don't feel like overly restricted by the discipline you learn. You can always somehow kind of like bend it to do what you want to do. And film the police. Film the police.
Advice. I think in terms of practice, maybe at the arts faculty, and also I guess from what I gather, everyone here comes from very different disciplines, right? It's like a transdisciplinary lecture series. It can feel messy to bring together different forms of knowledges, different disciplines, and we experience that also. Yeah, maybe not in our day-to-day, but every once in a while we can see the messiness of bringing these things into conversations. But it's really worthwhile, and it's really where kind of like the good ideas start to kind of emerge and continue that dialogue and continue the conversation.
Final one, get messy. I wish you a wonderful evening, a wonderful Monday, good semester break, and thank you for being here. And thanks for you guys.
Two very waffly answers at the end.